Hello and welcome back to our series on Objects of Crisis. In this moment of pandemic, we decided to look at objects in the collection of the British Museum to learn about how people in the past have faced major challenges, how they have prevailed, and how they have come on top of it. Today it's my great pleasure to welcome author, playwright, broadcaster, political commentator, critic, former deputy chair of the British Museum, Bonnie Greer. And I can't wait to hear which object you have chosen.
I've chosen Hartwig, the object that I fell in love with when I came to the museum and got into big arguments about, which is the Akan drum. The Akan drum was found in what is now Virginia, and it was found in about the 18th century, mid-18th century. And up until maybe 70, 80 years ago, it was thought to be an indigenous object because the skin is deer skin, which is from Virginia. And so it was treated as that and thought of as that and put in the Americas section of the British Museum. And then because the British Museum did what it does and what all museums do, it started to look, test, and realized that the wood and the cork, which holds up the skin across of the drum, is actually from West Africa. So it can't be an indigenous American object. It is actually a West African object, which was amazing to discover. And then the next thing they pieced together, the scholars, the curators, was how did it get to Virginia? Well, the only explanation of it getting to Virginia and in the collection of Hans Sloane eventually was that it must have crossed over on a slave ship with my ancestors. So then the next story that you do is you ask yourself how and why, which is what museums do. Well, the why had to be that it was a kind of comfort, also an exercise object, because the enslaved weren't going to be of any use if they were sitting around for that voyage and stressed out. By the time they got them to the places where they were going to be sold, if they were all stressed out, I wasn't going to work. So the drum becomes, or people are surmising, that the drum became an exercise instrument, get people up. Also, in my sort of understanding of it, my feeling, and I want to talk a lot about feelings because I'm not a formal scholar, so everything comes from there. My feeling is that it becomes an object of crisis when people began or thought, am I going to get up and move? Because you had three options if you're a woman, because the men were chained down. You had three options. You're going to fight this thing, and women did, and women turned slave ships around. Women fought all the way across. You're going to die, just lay down, be depressed, and die. Or you're going to get up and move around and live. And so the Akan drum for me, as a dramatist, becomes this instrument in which people have to ask these questions. What am I going to do? And the answer to the question makes you a new person.
Well, the drum is a symbol, perhaps, for what happens on that passage when you say, you stay alive. You turn your back to where you come from and you face a completely unknown and extremely hard future, but you decide, I live, we are going to live.
So the drum reminds me of that courageous, transcendental moment when my ancestors and all of us who are in the so-called diaspora, a word I don't use, but all of us decided to live. So the drum is funny because when I first saw it in Gallery 26, and it's low lighting. And, you know, me being an American from Chicago, I'm like, woo, that needs to be lit up. And I was rushing around screaming about this. And of course, I had to be schooled. Um, the drum is still alive. The deerskin, everything, the wood is still alive. So if you turn on the Klieg lights, you're gonna kill it. So to see it in this half light, surrounded by other objects of the Americas, North America, has now become a very moving testament for me. It has become a very moving dialogue for me. It reminds me, like the Benin bronzes, of the erasure and my struggle as an African American, as a Black woman, as an artist, to constantly try and remember bits, if I can remember.
And perhaps we could go for a moment back to Virginia, because you mentioned that the drum was taken there, and it was taken as a means, as far as we know, to keep African Americans from doing their music, and through that music, asserting their identity. And not only asserting their identity, but as we know from various occasions, also communicating and coordinating their struggle against oppression, so that the drum actually becomes also an instrument, in that sense, an instrument of struggle.
I wonder. Most of us just want to stay alive. That's the game. If you read a lot, if you listen to the blues, which is my cultural music, my dad was a Mississippi sharecropper. We grew up in Mississippi in the 30s during high segregation. A lot of the blues is just about survival. It's just, you know, you want to stay alive because everything around you is set up to make sure you stay alive as long as you're useful, and then you're gone. So the Civil War in America happens mainly because without this slave labor, there is no GDP in the South. The South is nothing. Without having my ancestors work the cotton fields, the South can't exist. So what Lincoln does, which is an act of genius, he does an executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation and tells the Union soldiers, my ancestors are collateral, we're war collateral. So when you go into a plantation, you release these Black people, not because they're not gonna be free or anything, they're collateral. So get them off of that plantation as fast as you can, because the minute my ancestors are off there, the economy collapses. And you know, we mustn't romanticize this. It's vital that we don't. This was completely about dollars and cents. And we, because we've been Christianized, that was one way of creating fantasy for us. We're made to believe that it's, you know, we make songs about the North Star and about going to heaven, you know, it keeps you alive. But this was a 100% money situation in which what Europe did cleverly was, in order to keep the money flowing, it created us as subhuman.
And that is the underlying rationale of racism.
Absolutely. We're not humans. We are, you know, we are 3/4 human, as the African America, I mean, as the United States says, we're 3/4 human. We're not, you know, Jefferson Davis, who is captured, president of the Confederacy, he said, don't tie me up like a person without a soul, i.e. a Black person. And so, you know, again, being insouciant, we create soul music. We create this thing called soul music. part of what I'm interested in, and part of what Meta Africa is interested in, and part of my curation at the British Museum, called the Era of Reclamation, that you and I and other colleagues are making, is to interrogate. We must interrogate. We mustn't descend into fantasy. We mustn't descend into any of that, because the story of the transatlantic slave trade is massively complex. It's massively about collusion. It's about trade. It's about barter. It's about sacrifice. It's about genius. It's about all of these things. And I feel I kind of, I agree with Samuel L. Jackson. I mean, he and I are the same age, and you know, we were teenagers in the 60s, and we were in the streets in 1958, and I mean 68, and you know, we were screaming Black Power, and we were burning the cities, and we were marching on the police. And I saw something that Samuel said the other day on TV. He said, you know, you couldn't have told me 50 years ago that I'd be back at this place. And you can't tell young people that either. I mean, because we're not available for that. And you don't do it. All you can do as a person who was there is to witness.
That is very powerful. You observe, but you also share what you've seen, what you've experienced. That's what makes the witness. And the witness is, in a way, the individual, the one person that gives reality.
And as I stepped into the part of the witness at this afternoon or late afternoon of my life, I think about, what are museums for? What are global museums for? Like the British Museum, like the museums of Germany, like the Louvre. What are these things for in relation to these questions? They have to be places of fluidity. They have to be places where ambiguity comes in. They have to be places where questions are not answered. Because one of the geniuses, I think, of the little bit of culture that I know in relation to Africa is a constant mutation, the constant change, the constant eliciting of the trickster, Eshun, always, you know, to turn the thing over and look at it another way. Not to lock anything down, but the fluidity. Museums must become fluid. And part of it has to do with co-curating, which means literally, which is what we're doing at the British Museum, which is what my project is about. Bring people in and say, yeah, but that's what this is too. And you don't have to have an Oxbridge degree to do that. And this is happening. But what are they for? They are for somebody like me who saw the Benin bronzes for the first time. And my whole history is about erasure and the fight to hold on. To see my face in this sculpture, to see my face, to see my cousin's face, is a defiance of erasure. It becomes the greatest thing that can happen to an enslaved person or descendant of an enslaved person: remembrance. So the sculptures become transactional in that sense. Now, whether they stay, whether they go, it's a matter for the Nigerian people, it's a matter for the museum. And these are all things that have to be worked out. But I'm talking about myself alone, standing there with a drum and having and remembrance. And you remember in your body, you remember in your mind, you remember the things your grandmother told you, the bits and pieces that she was told. And so to be Meta Africa is a constant defiance of erasure, a constant defiance of fantasy, a constant defiance of ahistoricity, a constant defiance of politics, in the sense where politics becomes locked in, becomes behind slogans or any of that. what is so beautiful to me about Meta Africa, the Caribbean, Spanish, French, English, Dutch, North and South America, Central America, the incredibleness of Brazil, and Jamaica, for instance, where people are able to run away and create these realities that become places, not necessarily a political defiance, because sometimes you can't defy politically, you're mowed down, but a rigorous insouciance, a rigorous ridicule, of rigorous messages and music, of all of that, and a deep, deep faith in survival. Deep faith in survival, because I am the descendant of a survivor in a deep way. Everybody who is descended from enslaved people, we're all survivors. And if we return to anything, is to that moment when we decided to survive, and that doesn't exist anywhere except on a slave ship crossing the Middle Passage. And so the drum is, for me, it was very funny because one of the curators, who's no longer with the museum, he's with another museum, tweeted to me the other day. He said, "You don't know all the turmoil that was behind the scenes of the British Museum in 2010 when I was supposed to do a program about the drum." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Oh, it was all kept down, very English way, keep it all very quiet. But they were afraid that I was when the drum came on the table with me, that I was going to play it. Of course, you can't play it because it would be destroyed." And I said, what they didn't understand was that the drum played me. The drum plays me. The drum is playing me. That's Ishun. That's what's in the museum. That's what's dancing around. The drum is playing me. The Benin bronzes, and again, what people decide to do with the Benin bronzes is a matter for people to decide. But while they're there, they're talking to me all the time. They're relating to me all the time. I see my eyes, I see my face. I have that conversation and a dialogue with them all the time. And so, I grow up with a kente and everybody's saying, "You're Akan." I'm thinking, I look like I come from Benin, actually. I don't think I come from Ghana. And that becomes my slow remembering. And that is the greatest act of resistance that anybody who's a descendant of slaves can have. Remember, remember, remember. And the Akan drum for me is remembrance. And in remembrance is resistance.